we're going to turn our attention now to foreign affairs, because there is a lot going on in geopolitics at the moment, and who better to discuss the lot of it with than Colonel Simon Diggins, military and defence analyst. Simon, great to have you on the programme. Let's kick off. First of all, we're talking about this sort of little summit that's happened between Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping of China. We've known for a long time that Russia and China have a growing allegiance, along with Iran. North Korea also wading in every now and then when they're not spreading their conspiracy theories and being generally weird and setting off more missiles than anyone in the history of the world. How worried should we be? Because for a long time, I think that the West have sort of anticipated that China they don't really want Russia to go too far when it comes to territory taking in Ukraine and saber rattling and aggression, because China has a rather different agenda when it comes to building up might. They seem to like might through economy. But when it comes to these deepening military ties, selling each other in return, I think, for Russia giving more cheapo energy to Beijing, Beijing giving them technology for weapons. I mean, has the pragmatism started to fade? Can they see an opportunity now for each other's ends to actually start sort of ramping up the ante, so to speak?
You've outlined it really well, Alex. Thank you. I mean, we've seen, as you say rightly, there's been this linking together for a while. Immediately prior to the invasion of Ukraine in February 22, there was a summit meeting which took place there as well. So that is going. I think what this one does essentially is build for the future, in the sense that some of the other changes we've seen in Putin's Russia have also been this kind of sense of a long conflict. We saw the changeover of the Russian defense minister. Shoigu was out, and a man called, I have to check my writing, a man called Belousov was brought in. Now, Belousov's background is in defense procurement, defense economy. And essentially the point is, I think, is that what Putin's recognized is that this conflict with Ukraine now and with the West in the future is going to be of long duration, and therefore need to make sure that that's in good order. I think this is where this linkage with China is so important. We know already, even though there are sanctions available and the Chinese trying to hide it, that they're providing dual-use goods to Russia for their economy, items which could have plausibly a civilian use, but also items being used for military purposes as well. So that is part of what they're doing as well. And China and Russia are also just kind of selling each other normal goods, things that we need every day that Russia had previously perhaps got from the West, they're now getting from China itself. So I think this close relationship with them is really important. As you say, it's strategic. They're looking for a period of conflict with the West, competition, challenge, everything. China, of course, is ambiguous, because China is also a major manufacturer for that. But it also sees this kind of axis of strategic linkage is really important to its change for the new world order that it wants to see in exchange for the one that we basically currently, through the Americans and post-World War II, control.
It's not the problem, actually, that both Russia and China, because they're not really democracies, are able to play a long game, whereas we're quite reactionary. But when it comes to our reaction time, we're dawdlers. I mean, I remember when Russia first went into Ukraine and everyone in the West said, well, he's not going to do it. These are just military exercises, aren't they? And then in he goes. And then we said, oh, well, we're going to put some sanctions on him. Various countries in Europe less than keen to do that, so there was dawdling there. Then when we brought about a sanctions package, it was just a few sort of, kleptocrats and, some of Putin's thugs who weren't allowed to travel and had their bank accounts and assets frozen. Then it got a bit more tough again, but it gave Vladimir Putin time to figure out how he was going to evade that. Now we're in a situation where Russia is taking 100 square miles of Ukrainian territory in a week, probably because we've dawdled yet again in the West for 6 months, while America decided that they weren't even going to bring to the floor the debate about whether they should give their 60 billion aid package to Ukraine. And so in that time, when Ukraine didn't have the resources it needs, guess what? That war of attrition has gone on and on and on. Putin's been able to re-resource, recruit more people, and yet again another ground invasion, and Ukraine find themselves on the back foot.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we're notoriously poor at it. Notoriously poor at recognising when the situation had actually changed. I mean, the threat from Putin, and indeed the sort of changeover of China's posture for one where we're going to cooperate with them. And if you recall some of the kind of positive noise that people like Cameron and Osborne did when they were in charge of the country in the early 2010s, their kind of view was that somehow these countries becoming more closely integrated into the Western economic order would change the way in which they did business. In fact, it did the opposite. I mean, essentially what it did was give them the access to our finances, to our economic structures, which they could buy and sell on, therefore, and they regarded what we did in terms of our internal politics and the values we espouse essentially as weakness. So that kind of failed pretty well comprehensively. But we have tied ourselves then to economically, and therefore very, very slow to recognize. So when Putin invades Crimea in 2014, when he invades into eastern Ukraine in the Donetsk area, in that same period, very largely ignored. And so we had this sort of thing where we were kind of blinded to what they were doing. So they could tell us a story, which was a comforting story, because it wasn't going to disturb our world order. Meanwhile, they're planning to remove and change that world order. And I don't think we're quite out of that yet at the moment. And you rightly highlight the delay in the provision of US aid to Ukraine as an example of that, where, again, we're still not being realistic about what we need to provide in order to ensure that our values, our defences are firm.
It seems to me that we're not being realistic on a number of fronts here. We're constantly found running scared because we don't want to be seen as being, I don't know, a little bit too right-wing, a little bit too decisive when it comes to the pro-Palestine marches, these university campus protests, the sort of stuff going on TikTok. When you look at the conflict in the Middle East, this is one of the most propagandized wars ever. We should be coming out and saying a lot of these movements have been infiltrated by terrorist organisations, by hostile regimes. And yet we just seem to gloss over this fact because we don't want to upset the poor so-called students who are actually activists in disguise. And that maybe it's about time we did start talking tough. I mean, in the last few minutes, Russia's ambassador to the UK has just said Britain is a de facto participant in the Ukraine war. Andrei Kelin, he's told Russia's Rossiya 24 States TV channel, they're the ones who say that Russia's going to launch a Satan-something missile into the ocean and completely deluge the UK with a tidal wave the likes of which has never been seen. He's been saying that the UK is considered as such because it supplies Kiev with weapons and shares real-time intelligence. I mean, Russia are happy to saber rattle, but we shouldn't be threatened by them, should we?
No, but our difficulty is we've put ourselves in a position where we're weak. I mean, and we've had a couple of conversations, Alex, in the past about how weak our defences are. So we're in this position whereby we make statements about we want to be strong, we want to defend our values, but being in a position where probably over decades now we have underspent in terms of defence, in terms of security, and allowed ourselves to become vulnerable as a result. So we are in that position at the moment, and we still haven't properly recognised that position. We've heard Prime Minister Sunak talking about changing defence spending, getting to 2.5% GDP by 2030. In the meantime, people who really are on the front line, the Prime Ministers of Latvia, Estonia, Poland, etc., are saying that Russia is ready for a general war in Europe within 3 to 5 years. Now, my maths isn't great, but I can work out that 3 to 5 years takes you in front of 2030. So we still haven't really bit the bullet on that side.
Yeah, some countries, think Germany is bringing back conscription and we're just, twiddling our thumbs. But Rishi Sunak at Policy Exchange recently has sort of talked up the need to invest in defence. But so far, the Labour Party pretty silent on this issue. Does that concern you?
No, totally. We've had. You've now got Starmer at least saying that that Labour is a patriotic party, and I'm glad to hear that they're saying that. But they also are reluctant to make those positive statements. John Healey, who is their shadow defence spokesman, I think he's probably a very decent man, has talked about things like forces accommodation, veterans issues, pensions issues, all of which are true, all of which need to be sorted out. But that recognition that the strategic game has changed. We are now faced with an axis of China, Russia, with allies in places like Iran and North Korea, who fundamentally want to alter the way in which this world is operating in. And for us to counter that, we need defence and security at a much higher level so we can actually defend ourselves. Otherwise, they will dictate how the world is. It may not necessarily be kind of open warfare we're dealing with, but they'll dictate how the world is, how the world economic structure is, the values that are espoused, and how the rest of the world operates. That is not a comfortable place for us to be in.
In terms of talking about dictating the way the world is, and before we're looking at defence spending and very much kinetic warfare, you know, your bombs, your missiles, your tanks, your wars of attrition, but something that all of these countries, China, Iran, Russia, seem incredibly good at doing is using information, using grey zone warfare, using bot farms, using propaganda, infiltrating the minds of the public and sort of activating them. And what we're bad at doing, I think, in this day and age as democracies, and rightfully so, we should listen to the people, is actually sort of, you know, being pushed and pulled in various different directions by all of this noise and information. How worrying is it that the UN has now had to revise its Gaza death toll by almost 50% fewer women and children killed than previous reported, where the media and you know, the various social media platforms are pumping out Hamas statistics, when actually a huge part of what is going on and the intention of Iran and Iranian-backed organisations such as Hamas is to create this misinformation and divide our society?
Yeah, I mean, the question of statistics of casualties is really complicated and very well. I have to say, I tried to do a bit of research on this when I was asked by your producer to look at this. What they've actually done is there are two sets of, if you like, Gaza-provided statistics which are running around at the moment. One provided by some of their government media offices, one which had a higher number of civilian casualties for women and children, and one actually provided by the Health Ministry, which had a less number. And it all appears to be around the question of, can they provide positive identification or not? I think the reality of life in the specific case, and by the way, I don't disagree with your general point about that we don't know how to argue, if you like, a case for democracy, a case for our values. Well, I really don't disagree with that one iota. But on a very specific issue around the casualties in Gaza, which is very tense and it is a very sort of sensitive issue, I think at the moment the detail, how that detail is being produced, is still rather vague. And the issue is actually, can you identify the body or not identify the body? And the discrepancy between the two, these higher figures and the lesser figures, is where they are identified dead or unidentified dead. And that's really where we are. I have to say, the figures are still incredibly high. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu still talks about 30,000 civilian casualties. So there is a dispute about what the numbers are, the proportion is women and children. But actually, the figures are still extremely high, 30,000 civilian casualties in Gaza. And I think that is, I don't disagree with your general point, but I think on the specific issue, the fact that it's been hard to get the information out, and there's been two separate sources of supply, both from within Gaza, and there's no independent verification, I'm not sure I'd necessarily at this stage advance this as part of your general argument.
Simon, thank you ever so much. It's always fascinating talking to you, and I could talk to you for the whole 3 hours, frankly, given the opportunity. I'm fascinated by geopolitics. I mean, we live in an interconnected world right now, and it's more dangerous than it's ever been.